Although many Americans view the space race as useless, this event affected almost all everyday Americans in multiple ways. To understand these effects on everyday people, one has to understand a little history behind the space race. The space race was essentially a technological and intellectual battle between the US and the USSR to see who could explore and make the most advancements in space. The US had no space program and little interest until the Soviets launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, the first satellite and man-made object to be put into Earth's orbit.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off!
This event caused the first effect of the space race on the American people: fear. Americans had always viewed the Soviets as lacking in technological advancements. In World War II, the USSR had outdated technology. This was a rude awakening for the US people and sparked an urge to create our own space program. In 1958, Dwight Eisenhower ordered the Army to make a response to Sputnik in the form of our own first satellite, Explorer 1. Later that year, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or better known as NASA, was founded. The USSR made another huge leap forward when Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit the Earth in 1961. Shortly after, the United States put Alan Shepard into space. In 1962, a year after Gagarin, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Later that year, NASA founded its lunar landing program, dubbed Project Apollo. The Americans pulled ahead in the space race when Apollo 8 became the first manned space mission to orbit the moon in December of 1968.
After the United States learned about the Soviets' climb toward space, many Americans became stressed and they feared that the whole world may see communism as the better over capitalism and democracy. However, the US government would not let this happen. In 1957, President John F. Kennedy came to the realization that the space race was very important. He knew that if he could build a better program than the Russians, that America would keep its power over the world and remain dominant in the global economy. 4 years later, in 1961, President Kennedy appeared on national television. In this broadcast, Kennedy came to explain that by the end of the decade, the United States will safely send a man to the moon and back with no implications. The people of the US rallied at the speech, but politicians thought the President Kennedy as crazy. Sending a man in space is one thing that's immensely difficult, but putting a man on the moon, that's pure insanity. It ultimately took 11 different tries, but President Kennedy lived up to his promise. The missions before Apollo consisted of many test runs to calculate altitude, oxygen levels, trajectory path, and many other elements that were included in space travel. Many were failures, but that only helped America get that much closer to their goal. Over $200 billion, and 8 years later, Apollo 11 launched. On July 16, 1969, at approximately 8:32 a.m., Michael Collins, Edwin Allen Jr., and Neil Armstrong launched toward the moon. Here is the footage of both the shuttle launching off and landing back here on Earth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
God preserve us.
Launch sequence engaged.
Lift off. The capsule has landed safely and the astronauts were okay. Mission success.
After the crew safely landed on Earth, Russia saw the end to an era. The capitalist economy of the United States had officially beaten the Soviets and their beloved communism. The Soviets had rushed to create their N-1 rocket that was powerful enough to reach the moon and back, but it was very costly. The Soviets had attempted to land on the moon in 4 unsuccessful launches. After each attempt failed, the program was delayed immensely. But the worst setback occurred when a launch pad exploded while a shuttle was taking off. After these failures, the Soviets lost hope in independently trying to reach the moon. We now have footage of 2 failures attempting to reach the moon from the USSR.
3 часа 18 минут. Все ждали чуда. Старт прошел точно. Но на высоте 200 метров снова отключились двигатели, и ракета плашмя упала на площадку старта вместе с 2500 тоннами керосина и кислорода. Мощность взрыва составила 5.
This is for Mother Russia.
The space race was essentially ended in 1975 when a US-made Apollo vehicle docked with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. The astronauts shook hands across the two vehicles, and their handshake in space became a symbol of the Cold War. This was another effect of the space race. Although the race initially sparked rivalry, it ended with a mutual respect that helped to ease tensions and de-escalate the Cold War. Now that you understand some background information, it is time to discuss the effects that the space race had on the American people, especially during and directly following the race. The first effect was the rising of tensions between the USSR and the US during the first parts of the space race. The two countries entered the height of the espionage between themselves. They were stealing information from each other to try to gain an upper hand in the race. Another way that the early space race created tension was the improvement of the ICBM, or Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. As the two countries were developing ways to put humans in space, they realized it was a perfect way to transport nuclear warheads to almost any location on the Earth. This caused the arms race to escalate even further. This all led to high tensions between the two superpowers. There were also some positive immediate effects of the space race on the American people. A huge effect on the American people during the space race was a sense of patriotism whenever a mission was completed. The country as a whole developed a fascination for space, and the astronauts became equivalent to war heroes in the eyes of the American people. Millions of Americans tuned in to watch the live footage of the Apollo 11 mission. The nation was captivated by Neil Armstrong's immortal line, "This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Another positive effect on the American people was the government's involvement in schools. The government wanted the mentally sharpest and brightest minds the world had to offer. The government put an emphasis on math and the physical sciences in schools in the United States. Good job, Mr. McClure.
Thanks, Mr. Burnett.
This was all in an effort to produce future scientists to help in the space race. The space race also pushed the improvement of computer technology. Although today we carry more computing power in our smartphones than the whole Apollo 11 mission, being able to rely on a computer for precise takeoff, lunar landing, and re-entry calculations was huge. The implementation of this technology helped to push computers into what we know them as today. Another effect of the space race is that it opened up a new field to pursue a career in. Many bright individuals found jobs at NASA that suited them better than anywhere else. The space race sparked a curiosity and motivation to obtain knowledge about space. Every little kid at some point has looked up at the night sky and dreamt of being an astronaut. The space race also opened a whole new field of movie genres. A huge hit to come out during this time period was 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968. The popular film series Star Wars was influenced heavily by the space race. A few more movies include Star Trek, Mars, Interstellar, Alien, Zathura, Gravity, and Apollo 13. Although these immediate effects had a large impact on the American people, the long-term effects are even more prevalent.
The space race not only had important effects in the US and the world in the 1970s, but it still affects everyone today. During the times when the US focused a mass amount of money into the space program, this also helped increase our military. From the space race, we were able to create larger missiles and our defense systems to shoot down these larger missiles. After the 1970s, the United States decided to keep putting money into our space programs, but also to help develop our military to make the US safer and also keep our position as a massive leader in global economy. Aside from our increased military production, the space program also helped the United States to create a product that our culture and economy solely relies on: satellites. At first, it seems that satellites are just big floating objects in space with nothing to do. But today we use satellites to communicate with each other, to travel around the world, or even our neighborhood. And satellites are also being utilized for defense against enemy weapons. Think about the cell phones we use today. Every single one is connected to a satellite that is floating in space. We use satellites for our daily entertainment. Without satellites, you would not be able to watch your favorite team on Sunday nights, or your favorite shows on Tuesdays at 8. We also use satellites for social media and news stations and other communications like that. Before satellites, people had to read newspapers to learn about what was happening in the world. But those views could be biased toward the region you lived in. Nowadays, due to satellites, all you have to do is look at your smartphone and you can get 3 different views on all the same topic. Another item that we use daily, thanks to satellites, is the internet. Satellites hold all the information that is happening on the internet. Think about not having Google and having to walk to a library to find the information about your topics of your interest. And lastly, one last thing that satellites help us use today is the global positioning system that we now know as GPS. GPS is very important because we are able to create accurate maps of the Earth, and it helps us to even predict the weather because we have the technology to study wind currents and ocean levels and other physical phenomenons in Earth's atmosphere. Another thing we use GPS for is traveling to unknown places. Thanks to Google Maps, MapQuest, and other traveling services that utilize GPS, we can now travel across the country and even the world without getting lost. Here is a short video of one way a student uses GPS to get around.
Are you lost, son?
Not my handy dandy GPS! As one can see, the space race has had multiple effects both during its origin and still to this day. It seems that the space race has come to a slow finish in the last few decades, but as new technologies arise and we keep improving upon our failures, NASA has said that they believe there is this new space race. However, instead of landing on the moon, scientists are now trying to send a man to the planet Mars. We still have many years before this happens, but as we modernize each day, the sky is the limit.